everyone, and welcome to Transformers 84 to 24, 40 years of rolling out, where myself, Primetime Moth, and my wonderful colleague, Audimus Prime, will be going through each year of this incredible 40-year journey with the Transformers. This year, we're focusing on 1987. Simon, thank you for joining me today.
You're very welcome.
We don't have any housekeeping from last week's episode.
No.
Other than we could have talked for another 30, 40 minutes and we never touched on things like the weird and wonderful season 5 version of the movie, which we'll come back and talk about in a little bit more detail, because that was only a new thing I learned this year, which blew my mind. But no actual housekeeping. I don't think there was any errors or any mistakes we have to pick up on.
Let's see what we watch it through.
Yeah. So this week we're going to talk through 1987, and as always, just kind of give you a refresher on the structure. We will talk a little bit about the cartoon for that year. We'll talk about the comic for that year, toy line for that year. We try and stick with using kind of TF Wiki to look at the kind of Western releases, so we won't touch so much into what happens in Japan. We'll touch a little bit on it at points, but we'll focus mainly on what we had, and if there's things that didn't get released in the UK but did in the US and we think it's relevant to talk about, we'll still talk about them. We're just kind of thinking about what toys kind of came out in that year. There's no point in trying to be accurate of, we've talked about this in other episodes, that we might have actually got it at the beginning of 1988. We're not going that. We're just saying, what is the kind of season 4 toys, cartoons, comics, etc. of that time frame? So, in 1987, and at 1987, if we talk about 1986 as being a transition year, where we see it transition from what people kind of look at as kind of being vintage Transformers, your 84 and 85, your Diaclone, your Micro Change, Microman, moving into new original molds, and seeing that kind of blockier colours, then into the movie toys. This is a year where I think they really go, right, okay, let's scrap everything we've done before and let's start again. And obviously there are some aspects of like Target Master, Hot Rod and stuff that come into this year, but this is the year where they go, let's just go a bit crazy. Go a bit crazy. What's your memories of 1987?
So 1987 gets a bit funny for me with Transformers, because toy-wise, I know that very little of the 87 releases I actually acquired until probably much later. I did not have a single Headmaster when I was a kid. I didn't get them until much later. Friends had them, but I didn't have any. I think I don't know whether I'd got into other toy lines at the time or what. And again, for us, this is probably talking more 1988 rather than 1987 in terms of what we're actually getting at that point. But it is where I started reading the comic a lot more. I think I had the comic on subscription at this point. I remember the Headmaster storylines and the stuff. Well, actually, I was getting it regularly before that, because the whole arrival of Death's Head and Target 2006 and all of that sort of stuff. But yeah, other than that, I remember the Headmasters episodes of the cartoon, and that 4-part episode semi-movie that was released again around that time. I remember that. I watched that a lot. So my experience of Headmasters was that. Yeah, that.
And I'm very similar. I didn't have any of the toys. Indeed, actually only have 3 original Headmasters now. They didn't click for me at first. You know, that transition to the more modern stuff didn't really click for me. I still wanted to try and pick up the Autobot cars I was missing from when I was a kid. I also, at this point, we moved house, and the core group of friends that I played Transformers with, then I didn't have any more. And when I went to my new school, nobody played Transformers, so it just kind of started to fizzle out. But my big memory from this year, from this year's releases is more on the VHS. The VHS was one of my absolute favourites, and actually I picked up a new copy. Well, not a new copy, a new to me copy last year when I did a toy fair trip, and I'll try to do it without the glare. It's hard when it looks. This just looking at the artwork on it continually when I was a kid. This jumped out to me for the very beginning. I absolutely love it. And actually, recently on Transformers the show, they were talking about that on the front of it, you've got your artwork that you would have from the toys, but on the back of it, you have Transformers that are not in the episode and are not part of it. So that's a really interesting bit of, we've talked about it before with the return of Optimus Prime having Power Master Prime. Clearly, the people who put these together were not really Transformers fans, but still an absolutely fantastic bit. And I have only just rewatched the rebirth and the build up to this. I absolutely love the rebirth. And the interesting bit with the toy line is if I was to go back, and I don't do G1 stuff, I like more articulated posing versions. I want my collection aim is to have toys that represent the things we saw on screen in the cartoon, and I want kind of posable, accurate looking stuff. So the idea of going back and getting every G1 has never appealed to me. I've picked up certain things again, or toys that I've never experienced, and we'll talk about certainly a huge part of that in a couple of minutes. But I never really wanted to go back and get them. If there was a line I was to go back and get, this would be the year I would go back and go, I want to experience them. I picked up a G1 hardhead during my big toy trip last year, and I loved it. I'm very impressed, and I think I'm going to pick up a couple of more Headmasters this year. I want a Chrome Dome. I always wanted a Chrome Dome. My friend had one when I was a kid. Always wanted a Chrome Dome. So there's a few there that I really like. So there's certainly aspects, but it was the toy line that when I got back into it, it was the one that intrigued me the most as well. The toy year, sorry, because I didn't have it. I then started to read up about it all, and probably you're very similar. That in the early era of the internet is when I found out about a very specific toy that we didn't see over here, being Fortress Maximus. Now, I will say that I could quite happily just talk about Fortress Maximus for the rest of this episode. Fortress Maximus was from the moment I knew that the toy actually existed, became my holy grail. A toy that I never expected to own. Then even at that point, it was like, this is way out of my budget. I couldn't justify the money for it, but I wanted it. I have now got the Encore, and I'll tell the very quick story of getting the Encore, or actually more so of ordering the Encore. The Encore was announced when my wife was on maternity leave, and we were cutting back big style cutting back, and but I squealed with excitement, like proper childlike excitement, and my wife. And the best moment ever was like, we need to find a way to make that work. You need to own that toy. That cannot not be part of your life. So we found a way to make it work. And she, to her credit, went back a little bit early from maternity leave because we had bought that toy. That speaks volumes for her. And you hear all these people saying, "What toy would you keep? What toy would you save?" That one, not just because he's Fort Max, not because he's Holy Grail, because it was so important and special to my wife for me to own it, that it is always going to be that special bit. And we have spoke about taking the toy rooms apart. Both of us had taken our toy rooms apart last year. The excitement I had bringing Fort Max back out and putting him back up. I'll never have another Holy Grail because nothing will feel that special. I don't think that. I'll have grails. I've got grails right now, the things I'd like to pick up. I always think a Holy Grail is the one and done. That's your top one you always wanted, and it is. He's gorgeous. What a toy. I can't imagine what that would have been like to experience as a child. Like, I've watched both my children play with them and have their first experience of them when they were old enough to be allowed to play with them. And that watching them play with them has been something else.
I think the first time I knew that Fortress Maximus was actually an actual toy was This is a little bit obscure, but I think other people will know this, especially if, well, most of our watchers are from the UK. But there used to be a talk show called Wogan, right? That used to be on in the evenings, and around the time that Home Alone came out, they had Macaulay Culkin on there, and this keeps going somewhere, I promise. And in in the interview, Macaulay Culkin was taken onto stage and had this big display of all the big American toys for that year, or it might have been that year or whatever.
Yeah.
And they had on a shelf Fortress Maximus, and Terry Wogan was making comments, and Macaulay Culkin was like, "Oh wow, that's amazing," and I was just sat there going, and yeah, it's that was the first time I knew it existed. I had a friend who swore he saw it on holiday in France in a toy shop. Never really convinced. And the first time I actually, other than in magazines and on the internet and everything, the first time I actually saw one in real life and touched it was around my mate Dave's house, who has a phenomenal collection of G1 toys. Yeah, but yeah, it just watching that cartoon and seeing Fortress Maximus as this gigantic, amazing thing, and just thinking that can't be a toy. And then it was, and then we just didn't get it because, yeah.
No, and it is interesting. I think like that there's so many of the line, the idea of the gimmick of the line, and I know that there's proof out there that it wasn't always going to be they were going to have be headmasters. There's proof of those original headmaster jets, not jets, sorry, the cars not having the headmaster come off. So at some
Mm.
point they changed that and put that gimmick in. What an interesting gimmick to take the
Mm.
headmaster, make him his own
100%.
robot, and then the target masters. Like target masters are an incredible gimmick in their own as well, and you know it's actually very well written to how they justify almost that, yeah, we've been here long enough, we're not going to give our heads over and stuff. But the idea of these extra little gimmicks, just a total change around, and the start
Uh,
of real gimmicks becoming across the
Yeah,
line.
that's but what I was just going to say. It's that weird thing where a toy that's whole thing is the gimmick that it's a vehicle that turns, or an object that turns into a robot. Somehow somebody thought that that was getting tired, so therefore they had to add gimmicks to a toy that was already a
See,
gimmick.
the best explanation I've had from that, and I like it, and it just there is no real, unless we speak to Hasbro and they turn around and say this is
Mm,
what we were thinking, and they won't. And we think we said there about the kind of vintage, the kind of Diaclone and stuff.
mm,
That was robots in disguise because they were disguised to look like things that you
mm.
would expect to see: tape player, an American handgun, things you would expect to see, and they could be hidden in plain sight. So that works as a gimmick. You come to this line, does I don't know, give me an example. Does highbrow work as a
No,
alternative
no.
mode? Do you see it? The Scorponok, Christ, forget anything else. Scorponok does not work as a gimmick. Oh, that's not a robot. That's clearly just a mechanical skeleton, scorpion. So
Yeah.
at that point, then I can see why they would then be like, "Oh, we need a gimmick to kind of sell this." And because I don't mind the futuristic cars. I never grudged them because you're watching, for example, Transformers a movie. You're
Mm.
watching Daniel on a hoverboard. We didn't know
Oh
what
yeah.
cars were going to look like at that point. So to have a futuristic car, to have a futuristic pickup truck and cup, that kind of, I'm okay with that.
Oh,
Come to this
100%.
light, this years going forward, some of the stuff, it's not, there's no part of me believes that Scorponok was ever meant to be a robot in
No, no, no.
disguise. So
I,
then it becomes, and actually, you think about it, I think the kind of more prevalent phrase now for Transformers, and I think back then was robots in disguise, is more than meets the eye, and it
yeah.
is that it's more than meets the eye, and that's where these kind of gimmicks then absolutely fall into that more than meets the eye
Oh,
kind of gimmick rather than being a robots in disguise gimmick.
100%. I don't disagree that there was a need for a new gimmick. It was just it was something very very particular to the 80s, was the sort of the building of gimmick upon gimmick upon gimmick. You saw it
Yeah.
with Mask as well, the vehicles that turn
Yes,
into
yeah,
battle vehicles, and then you had vehicles that turned into battle vehicles with separate vehicles that came off that had
yeah, yeah.
holographic drivers, and all of these lines they progressed.
Evolved their
And
gimmick, don't they? Yeah.
yeah, and obviously this is the first of many gimmicks upon gimmicks that Transformers adds. And I don't think, don't get me wrong, I don't think it's a bad thing by any means. I really, really am looking forward to A, them doing a decent live action movie, and B, them doing a live action movie that can involve some of these extra things. I mean, Headmasters was almost in
Yeah.
which one? Last Night? Because you
Yeah.
had Cogman, who was a headmaster. But
Mhm.
yeah, the fact that you finally had almost human scale
Yeah.
figures that interacted with your bots, and you could put them in the vehicles, and they also were the head or the weapon.
Mm.
And again, back to the figures. I did have a figure this year. I forgot. I had Cup. I had Target Master Cup with whatever his gun was called.
I didn't have any Target Master, so the first of any of these toys I experienced was a junker Scorponok that I bought in a lot. I wasn't buying to get Scorponok, but I still have that, and I've let both my kids have it and play with it with a replica head. My first new mold that I experienced and I bought was the reissue 6-shot, and that thing was glorious, glorious. And that's one I would pick up again. I sold that as part of prep for my wedding, and I would pick that up in a heartbeat. That was the experience of having something like that for the first time was just like, oh my god, this is incredible. So no, I think the toy line is incredible, and it's the 6-shot never got a UK release, as
No,
the Fortress Maximus never got a UK release.
no.
These encore releases were fantastic to bring these kind of toys back into the arena where they should have been and been able to be picked up. And you know, Fortress Maximus Encore meant that something of that ilk was affordable. It's still not cheap. Like there's no part of it is cheap. It's still an expensive toy, but in comparison to a G1, which also had the challenge of, is it going to be missing parts? Is it going to be discolored? Like how many of you seen the junkers or discolored
Mm.
ones? You're going to spend, you're still were spending a lot of money for something that was not going to be perfect. So these encore releases were a fantastic opportunity to bring them in.
Yeah.
There was a lot of actual the line that didn't come out in the UK. We obviously still have other ones out with the Target Masters. The Masters not talk about the Technobots coming out.
Mm.
I think there's Skylinks. Skylinks was just a beast of a toy that year. No,
See,
Skylinks came out the year before, wasn't he?
no,
I think I
he's
think he got a UK release in that year. Is that right? I think it was.
yeah. I don't ever recall him having a UK release. That just means I didn't see him, and it was
Yeah.
only when he turned up in the cartoons that I was like, "What is that? What is that weird talking space
Yeah, Skylinks an
shuttle
interesting one.
dinosaurs
I
thing?"
bought an Encore one at my first auto assembly and absolutely loved the thing. But yeah, so I think I'm looking at the list just now. Like the things we didn't get this year. Like there's some ones that I wish we had got, and I think I would have probably picked up. We didn't have the clones. We didn't get the mini cassettes. I think we got them in the next again year. And again, that doesn't stress me. I don't look at that. I don't worry about that. Oh, I did have one from this year technically. Not when it first came out because they never came out here first in 1987. But I had Goldbug, so I had one.
Ah,
I
of
had one
course,
from
yes.
this line, and I always forget that because he's. I'm looking at our list from TF Wiki, and he's not a UK 1987 toy. He's a 1988 toy, but he's that line. He's Christ is in the cartoon, isn't he? He's in the Pete first appear in Return of Optimus Prime.
There was a
Um,
lot in that 87 line that I didn't realize quite so how many figures had quite how many new figures came out that year.
yeah, yeah, and you know the challenge will always be that bit of what came out in this year, what came out in the next year, and again, it goes back to what we said at the very beginning. We're kind of just thinking about what was out in that kind of point. Let's kind of then focus on the kind of the rebirth then, right? Back to the cartoon. So the rebirth for me, I think the Transformers the movie is the greatest animated piece of material we've ever had, and both storytelling but visually was stunning. We get into the third season, and the quality is not great for a lot of it. Some of the animation are really poor. We then come into the rebirth, and I think the rebirth stands up as if you watch it if you were to release that as a standalone film, I think it would stand on its own right really well. I think it's really, really strong. I think the animation's cool. I think the introduction of some characters like Punch Counter Punch, like absolutely fantastic. Mindwipe was stood out for me in that. It's just a really, really strong piece of material. Stand in its own right, doesn't actually need to continue. Ends with the beautiful Zarek, but what does it say exactly? We shall see, Galvatron. I'm not going to try the accent. I would fail miserably at the accent. But it really was really intriguing. And obviously, we're not going to go into it in detail. I think we'll talk about it at some other point. But this is the point where Japan then goes, well, let's do our own, and starts with
did they?
Did they? Yeah, they did. They certainly did. And I always think it is for me, the Japanese stuff's an alternative future. That's an alternative option because it ignores the rebirth. Indeed, Japan did get the rebirth eventually. I think it was something like 95, 96, something because I'm sure I took note of it, but it was like
they got the
way,
movie
way,
in
way
89.
after.
It was way after.
But the rebirth, they got the rebirth as a standalone one piece, and it was, I'm sure it's like in the late 90s. So it just shows you that there's a huge aspect to it. Not having that in Japan, and they're going on their own way and taking their story down their own bit, and then it then leads into Master Force Victory and different bits. And it's always interesting to me is why didn't we get that? Why didn't they go, let's just take what they did and do it our own dub of it? And I also think that in this day and age, why have they not done that? Why have they not just went, well, we've got material there, let's release a toy line, because they can do the toy line of those stuff. It would be really interesting to see them do Pretenders, for example, and just go, well, actually, let's use the animation from Japan and release it now with the kind of better actors on it.
The interesting thing as well with the rebirth is it's called the rebirth, and it has all the Headmaster stuff in it. And I saw it on obviously on VHS, probably not in 1987 as we've already sort of been over. But to me, I had absolutely no clue that this was the last few episodes of the show ever made. I would have assumed at the time that there was still more to come. And again, I was still seeing stuff massively out of sequence at that point. I was occasionally catching episodes in various places, like on holiday and stuff. I remember seeing one of the Quintesson episodes at the beginning of season, or part of season 3, on holiday. But I'd already seen the Headmaster stuff, so I assumed this came afterwards. And also, I hadn't seen the return of Optimus Prime. So Optimus Prime turning up at the beginning of Rebirth, very confused. As I said, though, I never thought he was dead.
You're right. I only ever saw this in VHS, so it would have been earliest the release was 1988, where it came solo. So I think this is this copy. It then was packed the next again year with Return of Optimus Prime as a what would that be in 5 parts, 5 episodes in one VHS? Now that's a deal and a half in that package. You spoke about the aspect of the comics. The interesting bit for the comics for me was that when they decided to bring the Headmasters in, they did something they hadn't really done before in the Transformers comic series in the US, where they developed a mini-series for it. So we had the movie, which is technically I suppose a mini-series, but it's a standalone for the movie. And then we had the G.I. Joe crossover. The Headmasters was the first kind of mini-series that explored the ongoing saga in a little bit more detail, written by Bob Budiansky, who got a chance to really develop the basis of these characters. And there's a great deal of similarity in the personalities, more so than from the comic to the cartoon. But obviously, the cartoon and the comic, how they develop, how they come about, is totally different. Do you remember much of the comic? Have you read the comic?
Um, so at that point, I was getting the UK comic probably weekly, and bits of it stick out, but not massively. I think I really the stuff that really sticks out for me is a little bit later on, where sort of the Pretenders get involved and Karnavac and all of those storylines, and yeah, but that's for another episode. But yeah, the Headmaster stuff, not so much. I was aware of it and I probably read it all, but I have less. I think the whole Headmasters saga, with the exception of the Rebirth, kind of sidestepped me because I didn't have the toy, so I didn't have any
Yeah.
connection to the stuff that was going on. So yeah.
The my first memory of the Headmasters comic was that issue one. And the interesting bit we found out from Bob when we interviewed him was that there was a handful of comics that he would draw a kind of rough sketch of, here's roughly what I want the comic cover to portray. There was some that he was like, this is what it needs to portray, and he was so passionate about that they then became the actual comic cover. And the Headmasters issue one was one of those. And the first one, if you don't remember it, it's Fortress Maximus ripping his head off, which is a huge part of the story, where they're trying to prove, listen, we are here for peace. We do not want to fight. We'll even give up our bodies, which makes no sense to me. You're just going to sit there as a disembodied head, like, what is this, Futurama? So it never. I mean, it makes sense in the premise of how the story goes, but like, why would you just? We're going to give up our bodies. All right, okay, so you're just going to sit there as a head. That's a what an awful way to live your life. You want to go and you leave to go to the planet Nebulous because you want to lead a peaceful life, which also is a bit crazy because Cup goes along with them. And at the point where they're first talking about this, Cup's like, don't give up on war. Like, war's great. Like, why would you give up on war? But then goes along with them. So there's bits of the story that were kind of just clearly Bob's trying to shoehorn ideas into something. But yeah, that visual, I remember seeing that in a comic book store. So it's way after it's released, and it's a US one I picked up, but it grabbed me. And at the point where, I would say that was maybe 91 or 92, at the point where I've not really thought about that version of Transformers for a few years. And I saw that cover and I was like, whoa, I need to read this. And picked it up and was totally enthralled by that cover. And it shows, I think there was 5 or 6 covers that were Bob Budiansky sketches that became final drawings. And as we were chatting to him, I discovered that of the very, very few Transformers comics I have, I had 3 of those covers. It just shows that there is an aspect of, if he thinks it's important to get a story across and really embed it, it's clearly resonating then with the reader, and that certainly was one of them. It is a really interesting story development, how it goes through, how it goes. That there's some crazy. It's like, you've got animation errors. There's errors in the story. So when they first transform the head, and then your Cerebros goes on, or it's got the actual Cerebros head on Fort Max rather than Fort Max head on Fort Max. It's such interesting. I would love to have a toy iteration of that Fort Max from the comics, and a Scorponok in scale. Like, I'm okay with the toys not being in scale. That never ever stressed me. Actually, probably made me want Fort Max more, knowing they was stupidly out of scale because he's a beast of a toy. And in the 80s, play sets and big toys were awesome. Like Boulder Hill was just incredible. But that visual of the comic one is something I would love to own, a kind of more accurate version. It doesn't need to be huge. I've got the Toy World Toy World Infinitor, that scales along with your Titans Returns. and it looks really nice to be in that kind of scale. I'd love to see a kind of proper comic version of them come across. But the other ones we have for that year, you had more Ladybird books. This was the only thing that I really had from that year that really stuck with me was the Ladybird books. I think I had most of the Ladybird books when I was a kid, but I love that one. I think that's why I like Chrome Dome. Chrome Dome's the one I would want to pick up
Yeah.
because it looks cool as anything. There is two guns, and then hard head in the back. You know, a big tank. It's not to love about a big green tank. That's not Decepticon.
Hardhead is definitely my favorite.
And even that, like, then you get your interior artwork and it's got Target Master Hot Rod. And I wanted a Target Master Hot Rod. I remember very much wanting a Target Master Hot Rod and was told no because you already have Hot Rod at home. And this is the point where I tell the honest truth. I then broke my Hot Rod with the anticipation that I would then get a replacement Hot Rod. I never got a replacement Hot Rod. I was just told to dry my eyes because you've broke your toy. Deal with it. And the other thing we haven't talked about, and I think we'll talk about in great detail, maybe in a kind of mini bit, is the annuals, the Transformer annuals. You know, we still had the annuals at this point, delivering us some beautiful artwork from the from the toy line, and some really good stories. And I think that's the having picked up some of the Hachettes, I was really impressed to see that the Hachettes include some of the stories from the Transformers annuals because there's some cracking stories in those.
I think for me, one of the most interesting things about the toy line of this year is how far the toy line has come in only 3 years of existence. I mean, in my head, I thought Headmasters and Target Masters and stuff were many years down the line. But then again, I think my perception of it is that like the Autobot cars and that and the jets, the Seekers and Optimus Prime and Megatron and all of that, the original ones were 2 or 3 years. And then we had the movie stuff for 2 or 3 years. And then, I mean, I know the timeline doesn't work, but in my brain, that's how it felt, that they were 2 or 3 years each. And I was trying to think the other day about when other toy lines and stuff came about, like Mask and Centurions and stuff like that, and how they slotted in right in the middle of all of this stuff. But it all feels very separate in my sort of recollection. I was looking for a figure to do for the 85 retro review, and I don't have any 85 Transformers or any 85 Transformers that would be particularly good. And I found I've got a Secret Wars figure. I thought, oh yeah, that was 85. Nah, that was 84. But yeah, anyway, weird time dilation in memory.
We talked about gimmicks. One bit we forgot about with the gimmicks, the Headmaster was, and I've got I'm not going to bring my formats down. Power levels, which I didn't know about until like way later on, because as much as my friend had Crodrome, I never really saw that. I don't remember it. And that enthralled me when I first found out about it. I was like, this is incredible. I kind of, at that point, wanted to just own, didn't care about the bodies. I just wanted to own each of the different heads to be able to do the different bit down. And to an extent, some of the kind of third parties have done it, but nothing has ever done that gimmick as well as this toy line, this original line.
Not even any of the redone Hasbro ones have had it.
No.
Not anywhere near. No, which is bonkers to me. You would have thought at least with.
I think the Thrilling 30 Brainstorm.
3 and 30 Brainstorm had.
I'm trying to see where he is. I'm sure he has.
Well, I don't know if it was an actual gimmick. Yeah, there's.
This is good for us for we'll have this for catch up next week. I'm now going to go and look for that for afterwards, same as I'm going to go and look for the Macaulay Culkin Wogan piece.
Oh yeah.
The interesting bit, if you think about the reissues we've had, right? So we've had piles of reissues from the first 2 years. We're getting the retro reissues with your Blaster Soundwave, then the movie ones, the movie kind of retro ones coming last year. Other than the big ones, your Fort Max, your Six Shot, we've never seen them reissue your normal standard Headmasters. And that then continues into when we go into 1988. I've not seen anything from memory. I don't think we've seen anything from 1988 get released. It would be interesting to see them now start to go back and go, let's do some reissues of the Headmaster gimmick and these kind of ones.
I do wonder if that's to do with them still having the molds and stuff, because I know the lots of stuff's been reissued to death, but that's, as I said, that's such a bit of a glaring thing. There's a thing that came out fairly recently about a Hasbro employee being wanting to look at the archive of GI Joe stuff, and there isn't one.
Yeah.
When they want to look at an old figure, they go onto eBay and they
that's
buy
right, yeah.
a figure of it. So it's entirely conceivable that they don't actually have the molds for it, and because
That's a great point.
so Takara probably have a lot of the
Yeah.
molds from Diaclone and stuff like that.
You
I'd
can imagine
imagine.
them keeping that stuff. They can see them
Yeah.
being more, let's retain this stuff.
And if you think about it, a large percentage of the stuff that is reissued or redone in new molds is either original Takara stuff, so Microman, Diaclone, etc., or occasionally you might get the odd thing from a later line, but most of them were
even the
Japanese
first
produced
Soundwave
ones.
reissue. First Soundwave reissue was the Sound Blaster mold, which was the kind of Japanese mold. So yeah, and it's an interesting bit. You know, even Mark Clonis does that with when they were doing the review, the second video for the HasLab, and he brought his own personal copies of RID stuff in rather than taking archive.
Yeah.
Right, so we're getting ready to wrap up. We're going to go with our favourite bots. Mine's is the most obvious and obvious of toys this year. It is, of course, I'm not going to bring it up Fort Max. Like, I can't not have this as my favourite one. and shock horror, my retro review will be of this. If I went back to what was my favourite of the toy ones, the Toyhood ones, it's going to be Goldbug, but it can't be because I continually forget I even own Goldbug, so that doesn't say a lot for him. So it has to be Fort Max. What about yourself, Simon?
I'm going to go Scorponok. I didn't have Scorponok. And again, I probably didn't experience him for a couple of years later, but one of my best mates, he had a Scorponok. And I remember back in the days when you used to borrow your mates' toys off them before. I had him for a little while and played with it to death. Absolutely loved it. Although it was missing Zarak. I never experienced or saw a Zarak for years. But yes,
I was the same. I had to buy a reproduction Zarak to get one. But the thing I always say about is that toy, the movement of the legs as it crawled along, outstanding
phenomenal.
playability.
Absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah. And both my kids absolutely loved him. So it stands up to this day. But a great way to finish. Two absolute classics of the entire toy line in Scorponok and Fort Max. Two amazing toys. Where do we continue next? Well, we're going to move on to 1988 next year. And get on to years where we maybe don't know quite as much about. It's going to be good fun to experience through. These first 4 years are a bit more obvious. But thank you so much for watching.
Coming out next week. Yeah.
Ooh, yes, we do. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.